Thank you all. It is a pleasure and honor to return home to Virginia and to this marvelous library, and I thank you for this warm welcome. My book, Disunion, is the inaugural volume in a new series of Civil War books, The Littlefield History of the Civil War Era, a multi-volume series, many books and authors to follow mine over the next few years on a wide range of topics. Now, my aim when I signed on to participate in this ambitious collaborative project was to provide a synthesis of the scholarship on Civil War causality and also to offer a distinct new perspective. And so today I'll try to highlight some of what is new in my argument. Now, needless to say, the subject of Civil War origins has been treated in countless books and has been hotly debated by historians. And there has emerged in recent years a strong consensus, which scholars call the fundamentalist school, that slavery was the root fundamental cause of the war, and that the political antagonisms between the North and South flowed from the fact that the North was a free labor society, while the South was a slave labor society, which remained committed to slavery and indeed to extending its domain. While most modern-day historians agree that slavery was the fundamental cause of the Civil War, they also agree that much remains to be said about how and why slavery proved so divisive. And thus, self-styled revisionists periodically come on the scene, who lament the fact that the fundamentalist interpretation has a tendency to make the coming of the war seem inevitable, and they call for a renewed focus on the contingency of events, uncertainty of events as they unfolded, on the persistent political and social divisions within each section, North and South, and on the tricky question of timing. After all, the issue of slavery had sparked contentious debate from the very beginning of the nation's history at the Constitutional Convention itself, and yet it took another 75 years for the war to come. When I first started research on this project many years ago now, I imagined that my contribution would be to integrate the political history of the war with the social and gender history of the antebellum period. My book's cast of characters would feature not only prominent politicians and reformers, but also fugitive slaves, free black activists, dissident white Southerners, female abolitionists, and other outsiders to the halls of power. Once I immersed myself in these myriad sources, however, I found that I was moving in a direction that I had not anticipated, that I was drawn toward one particular theme and indeed towards one word that seemed to bristle with significance and implications, and that word was disunion. This word is strange sounding to our ears. We don't use it anymore. But I came to conclude that it was at the heart of antebellum political rhetoric. It was a word that had enormous emotional impact and that never failed to stop people in their tracks. Disunion conjured up the most profound anxieties of Americans as they considered the fate of their republic, their fears of extreme political factionalism, of tyranny, regionalism, economic decline, foreign intervention, class conflict, gender disorder, racial strife, widespread violence and anarchy, and civil war, all of which could be interpreted as God's retribution for America's moral failings. In the field of Civil War causality, disunion is treated by scholars almost without exception as a synonym for secession. I argue, by contrast, that disunion was a much more pervasive word than secession, and that it was put to a stunning range of uses, political uses, by Americans, North and South, across the political spectrum. Disunion was invoked as a prophecy of national ruin, as a threat of withdrawal from the federal compact, as an accusation of treasonous plotting, as a process of sectional alienation, and ultimately as a program for regional independence. It was a keyword of Americans' political vocabulary, a word that had no one fixed meaning and that served as a site for protracted political and moral conflict. Inspired by scholars who have argued that language has a profound power to shape political reality, my book asks, why could Americans not debate the fate of slavery without conjuring up disunion? In tracing debates over disunion, I try to integrate two narratives of the coming of the Civil War, one a relatively familiar story and a less well-known but no less important one. In the familiar story, Southern threats of disunion materialized over the course of the antebellum era into the program of secession. Only in the late 1850s did Southern nationalists succeed in building a region-wide movement. My book constructs in some detail a second narrative, the story of how anti-abolitionists in both the North and in the South invoked disunion in negative and even dystopian tones as a rhetorical weapon to use against anti-slavery forces. What surprised me most in my research was that at every turn in the sectional conflict, the central charge leveled against the growing anti-slavery coalition in the North by slavery's defenders was the charge that the abolitionists were themselves disunionists. Charges of Northern disunionism took many forms and called forth an array of defensive maneuvers and countercharges by abolition and free soil leaders. So in my book, Disunion connotes not only a Southern political position, but rather a pervasive rhetorical mode that suffused antebellum politics and gave sectional tensions an unmanageable cast. In my brief time today, I can only give a few examples, so after providing a little bit of deep background, I'll hone in on three key moments in the 3 decades leading up to the Civil War: the abolition petition campaign of 1836, the Wilmot Proviso debates of 1846 and 47, and the portentous presidential election of 1856. And then I'll conclude with a few observations about the secession crisis itself. So, deep background. The early 1830s witnessed the emergence in the North of a new sort of abolitionism called immediatism. Immediatists were a coalition of free black reformers who had long been in the anti-slavery vanguard and a small cadre of newly converted progressive whites. And immediatists called for the swift and total abolition of slavery. They faced a daunting task, the daunting task of breaking a protective spell that had served to protect slavery, to shield it in the uncertain years of the early republic. Pro-slavery Southerners had cast that protective spell in what one Northern commentator called a language of terrifying prophecy. Since the time of the Constitutional Convention, slaveholders had repeatedly predicted that if Northerners agitated the question of slavery, the nation would fall to ruin. During the Missouri Compromise debates of 1819 to 1821, for example, disunion was fastened by pro-slavery Southerners as a stigma onto those Northerners who wanted to restrict the spread of slavery into the West. Georgia's Thomas Cobb, in this prophetic mode, claimed on the floor of Congress to foresee a future that his opponents could not. He warned that restrictionists, quote, kindled a fire which all the waters of the ocean could not put out, unquote. If they kept up their agitation, the nation would fall to ruin. Other Southerners explicitly accused Northern restrictionists of endeavoring to excite a servile war, as if the mere talk of restricting slavery would embolden slaves to revolt. You conduct us to an awful precipice and hold us over it, one Mississippi delegate intoned, warning, again on the floor of Congress, of slave rebellion. Now, it's important to note that those Southerners who spoke of disunion in this prophetic mode were not advocating it. Instead, they invoked disunion as the terrible fate that awaited the Republic should Northerners break the constitutional covenant that sanctioned slavery. Disunion was, if you will, the unspeakable calamity which had to be spoken of to be declared unspeakable. It would bring, slaveholders warned, an apocalyptic war that no one would win, a kind of mutually assured destruction, to use modern lingo. Such dystopian images worked to protect slavery. So how would immediatists break that spell? Well, they tried, as I emphasize in my book, to model for their fellow citizens a new kind of social egalitarianism and Christian fellowship that would cross boundaries of region and race and gender. And this model of Christian fellowship was their answer to the charge that emancipation would bring dystopian consequences of the kind that slaveholders had prophesied. The anti-slavery petition campaigns of the mid-1830s, in which abolitionists flooded Congress with appeals for emancipation, dramatized their vision of a sort of politics of conscience. Thousands of Northerners, white and black, men and women, subscribed to these anti-slavery petitions. Significantly, a few dissident white Southerners, such as the Grimke Sisters of South Carolina, stepped forward to join this new immediatist coalition, and so too, in the ensuing decade, did numerous fugitive slaves, such as Frederick Douglass. Now, unfortunately, as far as the white Northern mainstream was concerned, the abolitionist vision of social equality was itself terrifying, no less terrifying than the specter of slave rebellion was. By the mid-1830s, white Northerners were up in arms against the abolitionist vanguard, assaulting them in spasms of verbal violence and physical violence, too.